Hello, Jakub. Do you feel anything American in Martinu in the 1940s? And if so, how would you define it?
Well, I think the symphonies, which for me are the main thing by Martinu, which mirrors the American period in the 1940s, have something of an American influence. It's not easy to define it. I think it would be mainly the continuation of exploring rhythms, which for Martinu was typical even before. But I think the rhythmical component as something which charms and triggers excitement, I think is rather typical for the American scene. I wouldn't go as far as saying it's jazzy, but I think it has a similar charm like jazz. Then I think a certain tendency for a natural and admitted effect of success at the end of some pieces, some movements of symphonies really have a tremendous trajectory to great, great success at the end. Let me tell example of the first or fourth symphony. I think motorism, a motoric aspect, that means something which links the music to the technologies of the 20th century. I think Martin was surrounded in the big cities, at least, by a lot of that. And if we look at it from the other way around, so to speak, I think because America is a country of a lot of immigrants, I think an American feature is also the homesickness, I would say. So I think the fact that the person who lives there and is not a native American feels grateful that he can be there, but that at the same time feels it's not really his home territory. And I think this cultural factor, which is typical for America in those days more than ever, is also part of the Americanness of this music. And I think including the links to what's happening in Europe around the Second World War. So I think it's an interesting component. And a European person in America thinking of his home continent, Europe, being at war is a very strong aspect behind Martinu's composing and behind composing of other composers, I would say.
It's typical that you started your reply with mentioning the symphonies because it was America who gave Martin the opportunity to compose for large orchestras. In the 1940s and 1950s, Martin was a great favorite of American orchestras, composing his symphonies for Boston, Cleveland, and Philadelphia orchestras, which were then performed by other American orchestras as well. How would you describe your experience with American orchestras and the audience in performing Martinu's compositions?
Well, I think Martinu, in my view, would always tend to succeed. And I think as soon as his music is put on program, it always does, it always succeeds. The difficulty with Martinu, as with many other 20th century composers, is that he composed as a very successful European representative at the moment when the American musical culture was really trying to find its own territory, its own success. And it did indeed. And I think it started prevailing in the United States, suggesting rather to perform American composers of the 20th century than European ones, except for some exceptions. like Stravinsky, who after all was staying and stayed and lived in America, except for people who became really classics of the 20th century immediately, like Bartók, for example, except for people who were rather exotic to America and really from the other pole of cultural world, like Shostakovich, for instance. Martinu's fate or destiny was somewhat complicated because he became part of American life to some extent, but then left it again. He left after the war. He left for the Switzerland, and it's until this day a shocking contrast between how successful Martinu was in his days, one of the most successful composers at all, and uh, and how relatively more difficult it was later to include him among the best ones. Uh, However, I think if you really have got a lot of conviction about some composer like Martinu and press his name into programs and get the the presenters to find out with you what programmatic ideas could have real sense, then suddenly, as soon as it's played, his music always grabs attention of the orchestras and the public. And I think lately, or in the last, say, 10, 20 years, the situation of playing Martinus music is much better than it was. I would even say that there's a certain tide coming in terms of his popularity. And the audience responds very well to his music, and the orchestras too. It's beautiful to play Martinu, so I haven't yet seen an orchestra who would be bored by his music, or who would say, or a member of an orchestra who would say, not really interesting, let's play another music. No, it's always triggering a lot of interest, and the main thing, it always speaks emotionally to the public and to the orchestra. There's a heart in his music which is immediately understood. There's a link to his native country. There's folk music influences which always create attention and response in audiences and orchestras. The rhythmical side, as we spoke about it, everyone sees he was a master of composition. I mean, the compositions are simply fantastically put together. And also he was a creator who had depth and proper philosophy about art and about life. And yet his compositions are approachable. So there's no one who would feel, this is overcomplicated and I can never understand this kind of music. In this sense, he really is one of those composers who can cause attention among experts as well as among laymen, people who just like music and want to go to concerts. And yes, and a lot of his pieces, apart from symphonies, have also a very strong programmatic idea. Like, if you play Lidice, Memorial to Lidice, that, especially in America, somehow always caused an immediate attention. If you play Gilgamesh and things like that, it's a later piece, but there's always I think in Martinu there's always plenty of pieces which already by the topic cause a lot of attention, and those pieces never fail later when you really hear them. That's not the case of the symphonies, but not only the so-called absolute music is where Martinu is a master.
Thank you. What were your US plans this year, and what do you see as realistic that will happen either this year or later?
Well, at this moment, I should have been in New York conducting Rusalka by Antonín Dvořák. That was supposed to be my debut. Well, that vanished. but I think I can reveal that it didn't vanish forever. We are planning doing it at a later stage. When exactly is still under discussion, but it will happen. So that makes me happy. In the context of unhappiness, it can't be now. I have lost also a very beautiful appearance with the Cleveland Orchestra. That's an orchestra where I tend to be regularly. It's an orchestra where I feel really, as a guest conductor, very much at home. An orchestra with a lot of culture, and we have a real genuine bond with this orchestra. That creates also a bond to Martinu, who also felt this orchestra was amazing and composed one of the symphonies for them, the second one. Chicago Symphony, again, I lost for the second time actually, a concert project with them after my debut once upon a time. I should have come back once and there was a strike. Now I should have come back again and there's a coronavirus. Actually, to be honest, I was in America when the coronavirus epidemic started. I was in Pittsburgh, starting my week there when it really got serious and I had to leave the orchestra. So I lost that one too. It's one after another, really. Now I'm hearing messages about next season starting slowly to be alive again, probably with smaller projects. Lately, I was discussing what to do in Cleveland, and I have projects with the New York Philharmonic, and with Chicago, and with Boston at later stage, and also some operatic activities, not only in New York. So I hope it will resurrect, so to speak, and I sympathize with America because the pandemic really hit the country very much, and I'm observing with satisfaction that at least the vaccination seems to be having a good progress there.
You are not only a great and famous conductor, but also a very gifted essayist. A few weeks ago, you have your essays on Martinu, which you wrote for the International Martinu Circle during 2014, were published in English. How would you present and recommend your essays on Martinu to the American readers?
Well, first of all, I should reveal that the idea of compiling a book of the texts of mine has not come out of my head, but out of yours, for which I'm grateful, and thank you very much for that. As well as the original idea of maybe sharing with our audiences, not only through tones and rhythms and melodies, but also through words, what my feelings about living with Martinu are. So a couple of years ago, we had a year of intense contact together when I wrote one text every month about Martinu, all things which primarily or secondarily or even at a large distance are connected to Martinu, have some connection to him. And it was a lovely adventure. I traveled around the world with my conducting activity, and every now and then, either because I conducted Martinu, including some less famous pieces, or simply because thoughts of Martinu could be linked to other thoughts about composers, about life, about orchestras, about whatever was actual at the moment. Such thoughts simply came to my mind and I shared them. I never thought, as I was writing the things, that they would survive for a longer time than monthly. But it did, they did, and you came with the idea of reading them again, maybe really putting them into book. And although I tend to be self-critical in conducting as well as in writing texts, so I wouldn't be courageous enough myself to do it, but I must say that some of the texts, at least some of them, really seem to be so fresh that I thought it might be interesting to read them. And of course, they have sense as a compilation because there was certain chronological logic in them, and so now it's amazing. They are there, and anyone can read them. And what I find really amazing, on top of everything else, is that you also initiated the translation of those texts to English. They were written in my native tongue, in the Czech language, where I feel really at home territory. And now, of course, in the Czech version, they wouldn't have an impact at all comparable to the English one. So I'm very grateful that anyone can now, respond to those texts anywhere in the world, basically.
To me, it's a fascinating diary of your busy conducting life, and it's a fascinating evidence of things a conductor is thinking about while preparing concerts, preparing programs, and it's fascinating to see your rise to fame. So I would love to repeat that every 10 years. So which from now on would be in 3 years. So count on me. I will come back to you with the same idea soon.
Well, once again, thank you, Aleš, for bringing this inspiration. And indeed, that year, if I may reveal, was one of the busiest indeed. That was a year in which I was doing a lot. It doesn't say that later years were radically less busy, but I felt that year was extremely dense in terms of the amount of repertoire as well. I think at one point in the book, I'm somehow almost decadently naming all pieces I was doing only in the field of Czech music, not mentioning the other ones. And I must say, I got shocked myself by creating that list, because it's really a lot. And so looking at that from this perspective, I must say, those essays are just a very small moment of that busy year. But somehow, when one is busy and has an action every week, artistic adventure of different kind every new week, it's beautiful to stop, focus, and create an environment for one or two of those events with more calmness and reflection and self-criticism and enjoyment, to stop time, so to speak. And this book somewhat stops time of my diary and functions as a magnifying glass for some of those gigs I was privileged to undertake.
So thank you very much, Jakub, and I wish you the success of all your future American and extra-American engagements. And thank you for the time you had for this beautiful talk.
Thank you very much, and I can't wait for conducting Martinu again and conducting Martinu in America again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.